He sat alone beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, a man swallowed by silence, until a small voice broke through the winter air. "You look sad, mister. Want to meet my mommy?" What followed wasn't just a meeting. It was a turning point, a quiet miracle in the middle of an ordinary park. Before we begin this unforgettable journey of healing love and second chances, if stories like this move your heart, consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story, where every tale is a gentle reminder of the beauty and kindness and the power of connection. Now let us take you to the moment where everything changed. The park was silent under a fresh coat of snow, the kind that muffled footsteps and made everything seem softer, except Holden Cole. He sat alone on a frost-covered bench, back hunched, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly they trembled. His black wool coat was neatly buttoned, his leather gloves flawless, his hair styled as always because appearances mattered. They were the only thing left he could still control. But the eyes betrayed him. Eyes like burned-out lanterns hollowed by grief locked on the frozen pond ahead. People passed, families, couples, children, none of whom he really saw. He was there in body but not in spirit. Not since Megan. Not since the accident. Not since the world decided it could go on spinning just fine without her in it. "You look sad, mister." The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, small, high, and unexpectedly clear in the cold air. Holden blinked. Standing a few feet away was a little girl, maybe 5 years old. Her coat was too thin for the weather, a wool hat too big for her head, nearly covering her brows, but her cheeks were rosy, her eyes wide and bright. In her tiny, outstretched hand was a half-eaten candy cane. She offered it like a peace treaty. He hesitated. "Excuse me." She took a step closer, undeterred. "You look sad. Want to meet my mommy?" Holden stared at her, stunned. He glanced around instinctively, expecting someone to come rushing in, some hovering parent yelling, "Don't talk to strangers." But no one did. The little girl waited, patient as the snowfall. I don't even know your name." "Maddie," she answered cheerfully. "I'm not supposed to talk to people I don't know. But you looked like you needed somebody." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. "What do you say to a child like that?" "I'm Holden," he said, finally unsure why. "Nice to meet you, Holden." She reached out and took his gloved hand without asking. Her fingers were ice cold. "Come on, my mommy's over there." Holden let himself be led. Something in her insistence, her total lack of fear, was strangely grounding. Like she belonged in this moment, and so, maybe he did too. They walked past glowing lampposts and snow-covered benches, through crowds holding hot cocoa and laughing into the night. It was New Year's Eve. After all, he had forgotten that. Fireworks would come soon. He usually loved fireworks. Maddie stopped and pointed. "There. That's my mommy." At the edge of the park, next to an overflowing trash bin, knelt a woman. She was sorting through discarded containers with gloved hands, moving with grace, even in this undignified task. A plastic bag sat beside her, half filled with dented cans and a nearly whole sandwich. Her long golden hair shimmered under the street lamp. She was tall, slender, her pregnant belly straining against the zipper of her coat. Holden's breath caught. There was something hauntingly dignified about her. He wasn't sure if it was pity or admiration that stirred in him, but something did. Mommy Maddie let go of his hand and ran forward. The woman looked up sharply. Maddie. Her voice was firm but frightened. She stood quickly, eyes darting toward Holden. Protective instinct radiated from her like heat. "What did I tell you about running off? I wasn't off. I found someone sad. I brought him." Holden raised his hand slightly in defense. "I'm sorry. She just came up to me. I didn't mean to. She does that, the woman said, drawing Maddie close. Her tone was not unkind, but cautious. She thinks the world is still made of soft places. Holden looked at her, then knelt slightly to meet Maddie's eye level. Thanks for introducing me to your mommy. Maddie beamed. I'm Holden, he said again, this time to the woman. And she's got a kind heart. The woman paused, then sighed. Sophie. Sophie Bennett. Nice to meet you, Sophie. He glanced at Maddie again. She offered me half a candy cane and a second chance at the world in the span of 2 minutes. That's got to be a record. Sophie gave a small, reluctant smile. Not practiced or polite, but real. You both look cold, Holden said, surprising himself. Can I buy you something warm? There's a little cafe just down the path. Sophie shook her head quickly. No, thank you. We're fine. I believe you, Holden replied gently. But maybe I'm not. Sophie's lips parted slightly. She looked at Maddie, who tugged at her sleeve. Hot chocolate. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Okay, just something small. Holden turned toward the cafe, his boots crunching in the snow. For the first time in months, he felt himself taking a step without weight. Something inside, tight and clenched for so long, had started to loosen. As they walked together, the snow began to fall harder. A flake landed on Maddie's lashes. She giggled. Holden glanced sideways at Sophie. She was quiet, focused on Maddie, but her eyes darted to him every so often. There was exhaustion in her, yes, but also a strange kind of strength. A woman who had learned to survive without losing her soul. They reached the cafe, a little walk-up stand with steaming windows. He ordered 3 hot chocolates. When the cups came, Sophie accepted hers, carefully holding it between gloved hands, like it was something sacred. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded, sipping his own. Then he looked at them, this little unit cobbled together by circumstance, and for the first time in years, Holden Cole felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar. Not obligation, not grief, but the first ember of hope. The cafe's heat was a welcome shock, though it was no more than a small corner shop with fogged-up windows and wobbly stools. It might as well have been a cathedral, the way Sophie stepped inside, cautious, irreverent, almost apologetic. Maddie bounced in first hand, still cradling her cocoa like it was made of gold. Holden held the door, then followed them inside. The smell of cinnamon vanilla and strong drip coffee wrapped around them like a wool blanket. A young barista behind the counter barely glanced up, too distracted by his phone, to notice that a strange trio, an immaculate businessman, a weary pregnant woman, and a 5-year-old in mismatched mittens, had just walked in. Sophie led Maddie to the farthest table next to a window partially covered in frost. She sat with her back to the wall, a mother's instinct to keep watch while remaining guarded. Holden set his drink down across from them, but didn't sit immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and pulled off his gloves. The air stung his skin. Maddie slurped her hot chocolate loudly, foam dotting her upper lip. She didn't seem to notice or care. So Holden said lightly, "You're the one with all the charm, huh?" Maddie grinned at him. Mommy says smiles are free. So I give a lot. Sophie glanced down at her cup, her mouth twitching. She doesn't always ask permission first, she muttered, but there was no venom in her voice. Holden finally sat. He wrapped his hands around his paper cup and studied her, not in the way of a man admiring beauty, but with the careful, deliberate attention of someone trying to read a map in a foreign language. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the way magazines suggested. Her beauty came from stillness, from a deep, quiet dignity that wasn't interested in being noticed. Her face was tired, but not defeated. Her coat, he now saw, was secondhand. Her gloves were frayed. but she carried herself with a kind of composure that couldn't be bought or faked. "May I ask?" Holden began carefully. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Sophie's eyes snapped to his. A flash of instinct protective, almost offended, crossed her face. She looked down at Maddie and brushed a crumb from her cheek. "We manage," she said. Her tone was even controlled. Holden nodded slowly. "I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't," she said. Then after a pause, "You just don't need to worry. We're not begging. I never thought you were." Silence stretched between them like an old bridge, weathered but still holding. Maddie, mercifully unaware of the adult tension, swung her legs under the table, humming softly to herself. Sophie stared out the window. "People look at us like we're broken, like we made bad choices and now we deserve this. You didn't. You don't know that. I don't have to." Sophie blinked, as if not used to someone answering that quickly. That simply. Holden leaned back in his chair. "I don't know much these days, but I know the difference between someone who's given up and someone who's holding on with everything they've got. And you," he gestured softly, "you're still holding on." Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then quietly, "You always speak like that, like you've practiced in a mirror." Holden laughed. It was short, low, rusty from lack of use. "No, I just don't talk much anymore. And when I do, it comes out sounding like fortune cookies." Sophie smiled, a real one this time, the kind that tugged up the corners of her mouth before she could stop it. Holden leaned forward. "Look, I'm not trying to fix anything. I know I can't. But I would like to buy you both something warm to eat. No strings, no expectations. Just dinner. We're not charity cases. I didn't say you were." She exhaled through her nose, a habit of someone constantly recalculating risk. Then after a long pause, she said, "I haven't had anything besides crackers in 2 days. Maddie had soup from a pantry." Holden's voice dropped. "Then let's change that. Just for tonight." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "Okay, just tonight." Maddie clapped her mittened hands. "Mac and cheese." They stayed in that little cafe for nearly an hour. Holden told Maddie about the time he tried to cook pancakes and set off the smoke alarm. Sophie laughed an involuntary sound that surprised even her. And Holden, for the first time in nearly a year, stopped thinking about time, about pain, about what had been taken. He just listened, watched, felt. Outside, the first firework of New Year's Eve exploded silently in the sky, hidden by snow clouds, but its faint shimmer cast across the frosted window like a secret. Holden turned to Sophie. "This used to be my favorite night of the year." She looked at him, genuinely curious. "Why?" He hesitated, because it felt like a reset, a blank page. And for a while, I stopped believing in those. Sophie tilted her head, and now? He looked down at Maddie, who was singing quietly between mouthfuls of mac and cheese. Now I'm starting to wonder if blank pages still exist. And maybe, just maybe, they're handed to us by people we don't expect. Sophie didn't answer, but her fingers brushed lightly across her belly, as if feeling for a heartbeat. Hope. Something fragile and new was forming beneath the snow, beneath the hurt, beneath everything either of them had ever tried to bury. The snow had slowed by the time they stepped outside. It no longer fell in thick waves, but rather in soft whispers, like the sky itself had grown quiet, contemplative. Holden stood with Sophie and Maddie just outside the cafe's steamed-up windows, the glow from inside casting a golden halo around them. He held the door open for a moment longer than needed. Part of him wanted to ask if they had somewhere to go. Another part already knew the answer. Sophie pulled Maddie's wool hat down over her ears, then wrapped her scarf a little tighter, her fingers moving with practiced tenderness. The kind of gesture you only saw in people who had learned to survive, not through luck, but through choice every single day. "We should get going," she said, shifting the nearly empty paper cup in her hands. Her cheeks were flushed from warmth, but her eyes had already started to pull back behind their walls. "May I walk you?" Holden asked, unsure whether it would come across as concern or intrusion. Sophie hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Just a few blocks." Maddie grabbed Holden's hand without asking and swung it back and forth like a bell. She hummed something cheerful and off-key, completely unbothered by the biting wind or the late hour. Her little boots crunched rhythmically across the sidewalk. They passed shuttered storefronts and lamp-lit stoops. The city felt different now, softer somehow, as if the night had chosen to pause for this unlikely trio. "You said earlier that New Year's used to be your favorite night," Sophie said suddenly. Her voice was quiet, not pushing, but gently curious. "What changed?" Holden took a breath. "My wife," he said. Sophie nodded slowly. She didn't ask more, not yet. "She died last January," he added after a beat. "Just after the holidays. A car accident. It was raining. She was coming home from a late shift at the shelter she volunteered at." Sophie glanced at him. "I'm sorry." "So was I," he said quietly. "For a long time I was sorry for everything. For not being with her that night. For not calling just to say something stupid like, 'Drive safe.' For waking up the next morning and not being able to breathe." Sophie didn't interrupt. She simply kept walking, letting the silence wrap around his words like gauze. "She was the strong one," Holden continued. "She made holidays feel like magic. I never realized how much she did until I tried to do it without her." He paused, his voice catching. "Lila was 3. Too young to understand why Mommy didn't come back. She kept asking me to go get her. I didn't know how to explain death to someone who still believed in the Tooth Fairy." Sophie stopped walking. She turned toward him slowly. Her breath came out in a soft cloud between them. "Thank you," she said. Holden blinked. "For what?" "For telling me. Most people keep that part hidden, like it makes them weak." He gave a hollow chuckle. "I spent months pretending I was fine, going to work, smiling for Lila, making coffee, sending emails. I was a ghost in a tailored suit. And tonight, he looked at her. Tonight your daughter gave me hot chocolate and called me sad. And I didn't deny it." Sophie smiled. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. Maddie has a way of seeing through people, like she was born knowing how broken the world is and decided to love it anyway. They resumed walking. A few steps later, she spoke again. "I was in nursing school, 3rd year, top of my class." Her voice was even steady, like she had told this story before, but never with the same weight. "I found out I was pregnant right after midterms," she continued. "The father left. No note, no explanation. Just gone. I stayed in school for a while thinking I could manage, but tuition prenatal care rent it piled up fast. You left. I didn't have a choice," she said simply. "I took a job as a receptionist at a clinic. Then I started cleaning houses. Then the clinic downsized. Then rent went up. You know how the story goes." Holden didn't reply. He didn't need to. The ache in his chest was enough. "I've slept on couches and shelters in the back seat of a borrowed car," Sophie said. "But I never let Maddie feel it. I made up stories every night. Stories about princesses who had invisible castles and dragons who baked birthday cakes." Holden smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You're good at that. Protecting her." "She's the only part of me I got right," Sophie said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Until tonight." They turned a corner and stopped in front of a brick building with an iron gate. Sophie nodded toward it. "This is us. Upstairs. Temporary." Holden looked up. A flickering porch light buzzed weakly above a chipped doorframe. "Thank you," Sophie said, her voice quiet. For the cocoa. For the conversation. For not treating us like we were your good deed of the day. Holden swallowed hard. Would it be strange if I said, I don't think I've felt more human in months than I did tonight? Sophie tilted her head. It would be strange not to say it. Maddie tugged her mom's sleeve. Story time. Sophie ruffled her hair. Of course, baby. Holden looked down at Maddie. Will I be in the story? Maddie grinned. Maybe. If you're lucky. They shared a laugh. Then Holden took a step back. Good night, Sophie. Good night, Maddie. Sophie nodded. Good night, Holden. He turned and walked back the way they had come. But this time the air didn't feel so cold, and the silence wasn't so heavy. Far above, another firework bloomed faintly in the distance, its light fleeting, but enough to see by. 3 days passed. 3 long days of silence. Holden had driven by the cafe once, maybe twice, okay, 5 times, but never saw them. No sign of Sophie or Maddie. The corner booth where they had laughed over cocoa and macaroni sat empty, the fogged glass behind it, bearing only the quiet smudges of other lives. He hadn't expected anything. Not a thank you note, not a phone number, not even a name beyond first names. But still, something in him had assumed they would return. That life would neatly fold back into this unlikely rhythm. It didn't. On the 4th day, it snowed again. Heavy, persistent flakes that muffled the city like cotton in the ears. Streets slowed. People retreated indoors. Holden stood at his apartment window, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the world disappear in white. He thought of Sophie's voice. She's the only part of me I got right. Until tonight. Something wasn't right. That evening he canceled dinner plans with a colleague and drove to the block where she'd said they were staying. The building looked the same. Still flickering porch light, still chipped red door, but the upstairs window was dark. He parked anyway and rang the bell. No answer. A second time. Still nothing. He waited on the stoop for 15 minutes, ignoring the cold creeping through his coat. He told himself he was being irrational. They could have moved on. Maybe a shelter with heat opened up. Maybe she got a temporary job and found something better. Maybe. But the anxiety didn't listen to reason. By the 6th ring, a different tenant opened the door, a man in an oil-stained hoodie. You looking for someone? Holden nodded. Woman named Sophie. She had a little girl, maybe 5 years old. Pregnant. The man scratched his head. Yeah. They were here. Upstairs. They left this morning. Real early. Left. Where the man shrugged. Didn't say. Landlord came by. Something about overdue payment or needing the unit back. She packed fast. Didn't ask for help. Holden's stomach sank. Did she leave anything behind? Just a book. Some kid's thing. I think it fell from her bag. The man handed over a slim, dog-eared children's book. The Brave Mouse and the Tall Hill. Holden turned it over in his hands. Inside the front cover, written in a child's handwriting, To Mommy, I'll be brave too. Love, Maddie. He ran his thumb across the note and felt something crack open inside his chest. He needed to find them. It wasn't as easy as it sounded. The city was a maze, and Sophie had left no breadcrumbs. Holden spent the next day visiting shelters. He wore his best coat, but his face was raw from the wind and lack of sleep. The first 2 places hadn't heard of her. The third barely opened the door before turning him away. It wasn't until the 4th, a modest shelter tucked behind an old church, that someone recognized the name. Sophie Bennett, the volunteer, a woman in her 60s with a clipboard and wireframe glasses furrowed her brow. She was here last night. Came in after dark, freezing. Looked exhausted. And sick. Sick, Holden's voice jumped. She's pregnant, the woman said gently. It's not uncommon. We let her stay in the family room, but space is limited. She didn't check in today. Do you know where she went? The volunteer hesitated, then nodded toward the hospital 2 blocks away. She mentioned tightening pains. Looked like early labor to me. Holden didn't wait. He thanked the woman and jogged into the street. The ER lobby was dimly lit and overcrowded. Nurses moved like dancers in triage choreography, weaving between gurneys and worried relatives. Holden scanned the room until he spotted a familiar mop of golden hair through a cracked curtain. She looked small. Sophie lay on a hospital bed, half sitting, one hand clutching her belly, the other wrapped around Maddie, who sat curled beside her like a kitten. Her coat had been folded under her head. The hospital gown didn't hide the way her ribs showed more than they should have. Holden didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. Maddie looked up and gasped. "You found us." Sophie's eyes opened slowly. She blinked twice before recognition settled in. "Holden?" He nodded. "I heard. I came. You didn't have to." "I know," he said, moving to the edge of the bed, "but I wanted to." She looked like she might argue, but instead she closed her eyes again. Her hand tightened slightly around his. A nurse peeked in. "She's stable. We're monitoring contractions. Could be stress-related. We'll know more in a few hours." Holden nodded, then turned to Maddie. "Want some juice?" Her face lit up. "Apple. I'll see what I can do." When he returned, Sophie was asleep, and Maddie sat holding a juice box like it was treasure. She leaned in and whispered, "Mommy said she didn't want to bother you." Holden's throat tightened. "She's not bothering me. She said she's tired. She has every right to be." Maddie tilted her head. "Will you stay?" He looked at Sophie, peaceful for the first time since they met. Then he looked at Maddie, her big eyes full of hope and quiet worry. "Yes," he said. "As long as she wants me to." He sat by the bed for hours watching Sophie breathe, watching Maddie nap in a too small chair. He didn't say much, didn't try to solve anything. He just stayed. And in that stillness, Holden realized something vital. He wasn't there to save her. He was there because somewhere along the way she had started saving him. Hospitals had their own kind of stillness. Even in the bustle of doctors, the beeping of machines, and the quiet urgency that hung in the air like static, there were moments, small suspended silences, where time seemed to pause and simply breathe. Holden sat in one of those moments now. Sophie was asleep, her features finally at ease, under the dim light above the hospital bed. Maddie had crawled into the corner armchair and dozed off, curled in a blanket, her juice box still half full on the tray beside her. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic warmed apple juice and something else, something Holden couldn't name but felt down in his chest. It was the scent of exhaustion mixed with grace. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The back of his neck ached from hours spent in this position, but he didn't care. He had been in rooms like this before. When Megan was dying, they had become his second home places, where he'd learned how to sit still, how to not ask questions, how to hold a hand and pretend not to cry. But this time, the grief wasn't his. And that changed everything. This time, he wasn't the one losing someone. He was witnessing someone trying to hold on to her child, to her strength, to the slivers of dignity she hadn't already sacrificed for survival. A nurse knocked gently and stepped in with quiet shoes. "She's stable. Early contractions have stopped. We'll keep her overnight to be safe, but no signs of labor." Holden exhaled. She's lucky, the nurse added, her voice soft, but edged with implication. Holden looked up. "She's strong." The nurse smiled. That too. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Sophie stirred. Her eyes blinked open slowly, then landed on him. "You're still here?" He nodded. Didn't plan to leave. She glanced around. Maddie Holden gestured to the chair. Out like a light. "She's been snoring quietly for the past hour. It's adorable, by the way." Sophie smiled faintly, but it faded as quickly as it came. You shouldn't have stayed. You have a life. I didn't feel like being in it without knowing you two were okay." She didn't answer right away. Then her voice came soft, vulnerable. "I don't know how to accept help without feeling like I owe something." Holden sat up straighter. "You don't owe me anything. Not a thank you. Not a favor. Nothing." Sophie turned her head toward the ceiling. People always say that, and then they change. I won't. She met his gaze, steady and clear. "Why?" He paused, then said, "Because I've been where you are, because I know how it feels to be seen only in terms of your struggle. Because someone once told me I was more than my grief, and I didn't believe them until they kept showing up anyway." Her expression changed just a little, but it was enough. "You could have walked away that night," she said. "I almost did," he admitted. "But then your daughter called me out for looking sad." That earned a small laugh, the kind born from weariness and wonder. She does that, just walks into people's lives. "She walked me into yours," he said, voice low. "And I'm not walking out." Silence fell between them again, but this time it was not empty. It was the quiet you sit in when you realize a stranger no longer feels like one. An hour later, a commotion in the hallway startled Maddie awake. She whimpered before she fully opened her eyes, confused, cold, disoriented. Mommy Holden moved instantly, kneeling beside the chair. "Hey, it's okay. Mommy's right here." Sophie reached out, arms wide. "Come here, baby." Maddie rushed to her, clambering up onto the hospital bed and nestling herself against Sophie's side. Her cheeks were damp. She had been crying in her sleep. Holden watched them, his heart thudding in his chest, with an ache he hadn't expected. Not pity. Not worry. Longing. Longing for what they had, even in all their hardship. That kind of unshakable bond, the raw, unfiltered love that came from sharing not just a home, but every ounce of pain and perseverance. Maddie peeked up at him over Sophie's arm. "Will you be here when we wake up?" Holden hesitated just a moment. "If you want me to be." She gave a small nod. "Okay." Sophie looked at him. She doesn't say that to many people. She doesn't have to say it twice. When the sun rose thin and reluctant behind hospital blinds, Holden was still there. He stood at the window, watching the city come back to life. Snow plows moved slowly. Headlights blinked on in early morning traffic. The world, somehow, hadn't stopped. Behind him, Sophie slept again, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Maddie clung to her, like ivy on stone. Holden quietly slipped his phone from his coat and sent a single text to his assistant. "Cancel everything today. I've found something more important." And just like that, without fanfare or drama, a decision settled over him. He wasn't going to be a ghost anymore. He wasn't going to sit on park benches waiting to feel human again. Because he already had. And their names were Sophie and Maddie. The hospital discharged Sophie the next morning just after 10. The doctor's orders were clear: rest, hydrate, avoid stress. The irony wasn't lost on Holden. Telling a pregnant, single-housing insecure mother to avoid stress was like telling a fish to avoid water. But Sophie didn't complain. She simply listened, nodded politely, and tucked the discharge papers into a plastic grocery bag that also held Maddie's book, a spare pair of socks, and a crushed granola bar. Holden offered to drive them. She hesitated, always hesitating, but finally said yes. The car ride was quiet. Maddie fell asleep almost instantly in the back seat, clutching the faded stuffed rabbit Holden had bought from the hospital gift shop. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded over her belly, eyes trained out the window as the city passed by in soft, gray motion. "I found a short-term place," Holden said gently. "It's clean. Safe. Paid for the month." Sophie looked at him, her brow creasing. I didn't ask. I know, he interrupted. I didn't do it because you asked. I did it because I could. And because you shouldn't have to worry about where you're going to sleep while you're growing a child and raising another. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then finally, where is it, West 92nd? Extended stay. Small kitchen, decent view, no mildew. She gave a short breath, almost a laugh. Sounds luxurious. To me, Holden said it sounds like a new beginning. The room wasn't much, but it had clean sheets working heat, and a lamp that turned on without flickering. The moment they walked in, Sophie made a beeline for the window and opened the blinds. Light spilled in. Maddie ran from wall to wall like it was a castle. "Is this all really for us?" she asked. Holden crouched beside her. "Yeah." "What do you think?" She grinned. "It smells better than the other place." Sophie sat slowly on the bed. Her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in relief. Like for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she could simply breathe. Holden set the key card on the small table. "It's yours for 30 days. No strings, no expectations. Just peace." Sophie nodded once. "Thank you." He turned to leave, giving her privacy. But at the door she said softly, "You'll come back." Holden turned. "Do you want me to?" Maddie jumped onto the bed. "Yes." Sophie's eyes met his. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "Yes," she said quietly. "We do." Over the next week, a rhythm began to form. It wasn't planned. It wasn't forced. But it was steady. Each morning, Holden would stop by with groceries. Nothing extravagant, just Staples oatmeal fruit, a half-dozen eggs. He never stayed long in the mornings, just long enough to see Sophie's face relax when she realized she didn't have to ration. In the afternoons, he texted her job listings, links to parenting resources, information about part-time nursing programs. She didn't always reply, but when she did, her responses were thoughtful, curious, hopeful. On Friday, she texted, "Is that nursing program still accepting applications?" Holden called the next day with the answer, "Yes. Evening classes, 3 nights a week." She didn't say much on the phone, but the next morning she registered. By the following week, Sophie had enrolled. Maddie got a small backpack and started attending a daytime play group hosted by a nearby church. Holden offered to cover the costs, just for a month, he said, but Sophie insisted on finding a way to contribute. It mattered to her. So Holden made a quiet phone call to a friend who managed a small real estate office. "Do you need a part-time cleaner? Evening hours, trustworthy, works hard, won't flake. She legal, more than that. She's determined." 2 days later, Sophie started. On Thursday evening, Holden picked Maddie up from the playgroup and brought her to his apartment so Sophie could go to class. The apartment, once sterile and echoing with silence, now felt lived in. Maddie left paper hearts on his fridge. Her tiny sneakers sat by the door. Sophie's name was scribbled in a notebook near his laptop beneath the heading, "Scholarship Options." That night, as Holden stirred tomato soup on the stove, Maddie appeared beside him, holding a plastic spoon like a wand. "I want to help," she announced. "Chef Maddie reporting for duty," he teased. She nodded solemnly. "Mommy says when we cook together, the food gets more love in it." Holden handed her a wooden spoon. "Well, then let's make it extra magical." They cooked together, read bedtime stories, and talked about stars and unicorns and what dreams are made of. When Sophie arrived just past 9, her face tired, but lit with accomplishment, Maddie ran to her in excitement. "Mommy, I helped stir the soup." Sophie hugged her tight, then looked up at Holden. "Thank you." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Later that night, after Maddie was asleep and Sophie packed her books back into her worn canvas bag, Holden stood by the kitchen sink, drying the last dish. "You're building something," he said without turning. She paused. "What do you mean, you?" Maddie. The classes. The job. This life. You're not surviving anymore. You're creating. Sophie leaned against the counter. It doesn't feel like much. It is. It's everything. She looked at him, eyes dark and full of questions. Why are you doing this? Really, Holden met her gaze. Because the first time I saw you, I thought you were the strongest person I'd ever met. And now, I know it's true. Sophie's voice trembled barely above a whisper. I'm afraid of depending on anyone. Then don't, he said gently. Just let me walk beside you. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she nodded. And somewhere beneath that quiet room, under layers of loss and fear and snow, a root took hold. It was fragile. New, but alive. The call came just after midnight. Holden had been up late sorting through some old photos of Megan and Lila on his laptop. He hadn't done that in months, not because he didn't miss them, but because he'd been afraid of what might surface if he let himself remember too clearly. When the phone lit up with Sophie's name, he answered on the first ring. Holden. Her voice was barely audible. What's wrong? It's Maddie, she whispered. She's burning up. 1034. I gave her Tylenol, but she's shaking. I'm coming, he said, already grabbing his keys. When Holden arrived at the extended stay hotel, the front clerk didn't even look up. He knew the room number by now. He knocked once, twice. Then Sophie opened the door. Her face was pale, and tight lips drawn in that way parents do when they're trying not to fall apart. She stood aside without a word, letting him in. The lights were dim. The kitchenette sink was full of cold compresses and rinsed washcloths. The small bed in the corner was covered with extra blankets, a thermometer, an open bottle of children's fever medicine, and a cup of ice water with a bent straw. Maddie lay in the center of it all, curled into herself, cheeks flushed, skin slick with sweat. Sweetheart Holden murmured, kneeling beside the bed. Hey, I'm here. Maddie's eyes fluttered open, glazed and unfocused. Unicorn soup, she mumbled. Holden glanced up at Sophie. She was dreaming about a unicorn soup stand in the park. Said she wanted to run it with you, Sophie said, managing a broken laugh. Holden smiled faintly. That actually sounds like a solid business plan. He reached out and pressed his palm gently to Maddie's forehead. Too warm, but not scalding. He turned to Sophie. When did it start? She was tired after school, but I thought it was just a long day. By dinner, she was quiet. I took her temp around 8. It was 101. Then it kept climbing. Holden took a breath. Let me take her to urgent care. Sophie shook her head instantly. They won't take us tonight. I tried. They're backed up. Said to wait until morning unless she starts vomiting or seizing. Holden clenched his jaw. Then we wait. Sophie knelt on the other side of the bed, placing a fresh, cold cloth on Maddie's head. Her hands were trembling now. She can't get sick, she whispered. I can't afford for her to get sick. I have class tomorrow, a shift the next night. The church daycare said if she misses 2 more days, they can't keep holding her spot. Sophie Holden said softly, It's okay. No, it's not. Her voice cracked. You think it's all manageable because you have backup plans. I don't. I only have today. If today falls apart, so does tomorrow. That's how my life works. Holden didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, well, really watched her. There was no self-pity in her tone, just fear, just exhaustion, just the weight of someone who'd carried too much for too long without ever asking for help. He reached out slowly, deliberately, and took her hand. You don't have to hold it alone anymore. She looked at him startled, not by his words, but by how much she wanted to believe them. But I've always had to. Then maybe it's time that changed. She didn't say anything for a while. Then quietly, what happens when you decide this is too much? Holden looked her straight in the eye. I stay. They sat on either side of Maddie's bed for hours, speaking in hushed tones, refilling cold compresses, and taking turns brushing damp hair from her forehead. Holden told stories from Lila's toddler years about the time she tried to clean his car by pouring a gallon of milk into the back seat. Sophie told him about the night Maddie was born, how the power had gone out during a storm, and the only light came from a nurse holding a flashlight while she pushed. She came out crying, Sophie said, loud and fierce, like she already knew the world wasn't going to go easy on her. She's got your strength, Holden said gently. Sophie blinked away tears. I never wanted her to need it. At some point just before sunrise, Maddie's fever broke. Her breathing eased. Her hand stopped shaking. Her tiny body relaxed into a deep, healing sleep. Sophie leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. Holden moved quietly, cleaning up medicine cups, tucking away used towels, wiping condensation from the window pane with the sleeve of his sweater. He did it not because it was expected, but because in that moment, he needed to do something gentle. When he turned back, Sophie was watching him. What he asked softly. I've never had anyone clean up for me. He smiled. I'm better with towels than feelings. She smiled back, the edges of her mouth soft and tired. You're better than you think. Holden stepped closer, unsure of what to say next. But then Maddie stirred, and they both leaned in to check her. She mumbled something incoherent, then reached out and grabbed Holden's finger, curling her small hand around it, like a lifeline. Holden's heart caught. She's never done that with anyone but me, Sophie whispered. He didn't respond. Couldn't. The moment felt too full for words. By the time Sophie finally lay down beside her daughter and closed her eyes, Holden had already pulled up a chair, slid off his coat, and wrapped himself in the silence of their presence. It was a silence that no longer felt empty. It felt earned. The snow had stopped finally. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the sun pushed through the clouds, casting soft, golden light across the icy sidewalks and glimmering rooftops. The city wasn't warm, but it sparkled fresh and momentarily clean, like someone had shaken a snow globe and let it settle. It was Christmas Eve. Holden hadn't asked Sophie about plans. He wasn't sure she had any. He only knew that when he showed up that morning with fresh bagels and a tiny wrapped present for Maddie. She opened the door with a look of genuine surprise, then something gentler, relief. They bundled up Maddie in a coat, 2 sizes too big that she insisted made her look like a marshmallow princess, and set off on foot. No destination, no schedule, just the luxury of wandering. They stopped by the park to feed birds with stale bread. Maddie recited a poem she claimed to have invented. Sophie laughed more freely than Holden had ever heard. Then they turned a corner in Midtown and stopped cold. It was a boutique window, one of those upscale, sparkling storefronts that looked more like a fairy tale than a retail space. Inside, under an arch of tiny white lights and pine garlands, stood 2 mannequins. One wore a children's dress, pale pink satin with puffed sleeves, delicate lace trim, and a ribbon sash tied in a perfect bow. The kind of dress you don't wear to school. The kind of dress made for being seen. The other mannequin wore something entirely different, a woman's dress. Cream-colored knit, modest, but elegant with a high neckline and 3/4 sleeves. It didn't shimmer. It didn't twirl. But it spoke. Of grace. Of quiet confidence. Of someone who had walked through storms and come out whole. Maddie stopped in her tracks, her gloved hand pressed against the glass. "Mommy," she whispered. "That's the most beautiful dress I've ever seen." Sophie smiled but didn't step closer. She placed a hand lightly on Maddie's shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart. That's not for us." But Maddie didn't move. She stood perfectly still. Eyes wide, breath fogging the window pane. Holden watched them both. Then he stepped forward, knelt beside Maddie, and asked gently, "Would you wear it if you could?" Maddie blinked up at him. "Just for one day," she said, "to feel like a real princess." Holden stood. Sophie was already shaking her head. "Holden!" "Just come inside," he said. "Look, that's all." Inside the boutique was warm and smelled faintly of cedarwood and vanilla. The clerk raised her eyebrows when Sophie stepped in, hesitating by the door, coat zipped all the way up, boots scuffed from too many sidewalks, but she didn't say anything. Holden walked straight to the rack and gently pulled the pink dress down to Maddie's level. "Try it on," he asked. Maddie's eyes shone. "Really? Really?" While she danced toward the fitting room, Holden turned to Sophie. She was standing near the cream-colored dress, her fingers hovering over the fabric, but not touching. "That one's calling your name," he said softly. Sophie gave a short laugh. "It's beautiful, but that's a luxury I don't need." Sometimes, Holden said, it's not about need. Sometimes, it's about remembering how it feels to see yourself again. She met his eyes. "I wouldn't even know how to wear it anymore." He didn't push. Instead, he stepped back and gave her space. Minutes later, Maddie emerged from the fitting room, twirling the satin of the dress, catching the light with every spin. "I look like a star," she squealed. "You look like you've always shined," Holden said. Sophie's eyes welled. She didn't try to hide it. Then the clerk appeared and handed Sophie a small bag. "He paid already," she said with a discreet nod toward Holden. Sophie turned sharply. "You didn't have to." "I know," Holden said steady. "That's why I did." They left the store just as the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall again, light scattered harmless. They didn't go straight home. Instead, they walked. Maddie in her pink dress, carefully wrapped in a borrowed boutique coat. Sophie beside her, carrying the other dress in a paper bag with a gold ribbon handle. Holden walked behind them both quietly, watching them navigate the world, as though it had bent just slightly in their favor for once. That night at the hotel, Sophie laid out the cream-colored dress on the bed like it was made of glass. Holden turned to leave, but she stopped him with a whisper. "Stay for dinner?" He nodded. Maddie sat cross-legged on the carpet coloring. Sophie changed in the bathroom. When she stepped out, the room fell still. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was tied loosely, half falling over her shoulders. But the dress fit as if it had been waiting just for her. Holden stood slowly. "You look," he faltered, then finished with quiet certainty. "Like the version of yourself you've never stopped being." Sophie blushed, then smiled a real wide smile. "Thank you." They ate dinner, boxed pasta with butter and frozen peas, and it was one of the best meals Holden had tasted in years. Later, after Maddie fell asleep, clutching her coloring book, Sophie sat beside Holden on the edge of the bed. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not accusingly, just softly. Holden exhaled, "Because I didn't know how much I missed belonging somewhere until I met you both." She looked at him, her eyes softer than he'd ever seen them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie said, "You make it feel like maybe we're not invisible anymore." Holden reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You were never invisible, Sophie," he said. "The world just forgot how to look." It was a Thursday evening when Holden realized the silence in his apartment no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. For weeks, Thursday had become their evening. It started as a simple offer. Sophie had classes 3 nights a week, and Thursday was one of them. So Holden took Maddie. At first it was just babysitting. Then it became dinner. Then stories. Then tiny traditions that built themselves without permission. Spaghetti with too much cheese. Maddie's mismatched socks in the laundry basket. Sophie's textbooks left half open on the kitchen table. But tonight felt different. He arrived a little earlier than usual, groceries in one hand, a fresh box of crayons in the other. The hallway light outside the apartment was flickering again. He knocked, then gently nudged the door open. The apartment was quiet. Lisa, the hotel clerk downstairs, had given them this small corner unit when Holden offered to extend their stay another month. It had 2 small rooms, a kitchenette, and most importantly, a table by the window where Sophie liked to study. That's where she was now. Sophie sat at the table, highlighter in hand, glasses slipping down her nose, her brow furrowed in quiet concentration. Her books were spread around her like petals, a cold cup of tea beside her untouched. Holden didn't say anything at first. He just watched her. She didn't know he was there yet. She was too deep into her notes, murmuring things like ketones and dosage ranges under her breath. Her hair was tied back, but a few strands had fallen loose around her face. She pushed one behind her ear absently. Her fingers were ink-stained, her nails clean but chipped. She looked tired, determined, beautiful. Holden swallowed. He had seen Sophie tired before, exhausted even, but never like this. This wasn't the exhaustion of someone barely surviving. This was the fatigue of someone reclaiming herself, and in that moment he realized something. She wasn't waiting to be saved. She was building something, quietly, fiercely, without fanfare, and all he had done was make space for her to believe it was possible. "Hey," he said, finally gently. Sophie startled, then smiled when she saw him. "You're early. I brought dinner. You always do. I also brought these." He held up the box of crayons. "Maddie's been saying the green one is missing. I figured a full rainbow might buy us some goodwill." Sophie grinned. "She'll love that." Holden stepped inside and set the bag down. As he unpacked groceries, pasta, chicken broth, a bag of grapes, he felt her eyes on him. "You okay?" he asked without turning. Sophie hesitated. "I had a quiz today. I think I passed." "You think?" She exhaled. "It's hard to be sure of anything anymore." He turned and leaned against the counter. "Sophie, everything you're doing, it matters, even when you don't see it yet." She nodded, but her smile faded a little. "Some days I still feel like I'm pretending, like I'm borrowing someone else's future, and at any moment it'll be taken back." Holden crossed the room slowly. He didn't reach for her right away. He just stood beside her and said quietly, "That future is yours. No one gets to take it from you now." She looked up at him, and for the first time didn't look away. Later, as dinner simmered, Holden stood at the stove while Maddie colored on the floor beside the table, narrating an elaborate story about a squirrel detective and a magical teacup. Sophie was quizzing herself out loud, flipping flashcards and muttering symptoms. Holden stirred the sauce and smiled. It was chaos. It was life. And it felt right. At one point, Maddie looked up and declared, "When I grow up, I want to be a nurse just like Mommy, but also maybe a scientist, and maybe a chef." Holden knelt beside her. "You can be all 3 if you want." She nodded seriously. "I know, because Mommy says I can be anything." Sophie looked up from her flashcards and their eyes met. It wasn't a look full of longing or romance or promises. It was something quieter. Recognition. After dinner, Holden washed dishes while Sophie tucked Maddie in. She came out of the bedroom a few minutes later, barefoot cardigan loose around her shoulders. "Thanks for dinner," she said. He dried his hands and nodded. "Thanks for trusting me." She tilted her head. "With what?" "With your life. Your daughter. Your story." Sophie walked toward the table and picked up her flashcards. "Do you want to know something strange?" she asked. "Always." She glanced at him, for the first time in years. "I don't feel like I'm holding my breath." Holden moved toward her, slowly, deliberately, no rush. no expectation. When he reached her, he stopped. They stood face to face, inches apart. The air between them was still charged, but not in a dramatic way. It felt like standing on the edge of something deep and finally choosing not to step back. Sophie looked up at him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are we falling into something?" Holden didn't smile, didn't joke. He simply nodded. "I think we already have." She looked down at her feet, then back at him. "Is that okay?" He reached out, brushed his thumb gently across her cheek. Not claiming, not assuming, just being present. "It's more than okay," he said. And then, quietly, reverently, like breathing, he kissed her. New Year's Eve came quietly, as it always did in the city, beneath the surface of noise, wrapped in layers of light and memory. Holden had never liked the crowds in Times Square, the artificial energy, the countdowns with confetti cannons and televised smiles. But he had loved the stillness of Central Park at night, the way it held its own celebration in silence, with frozen ponds, twinkling lamplight, and the occasional firework mirrored in snow. He hadn't planned on going this year. Not until Sophie asked the day before, almost shyly, "Would you want to come with us tomorrow? Maddie's never seen fireworks from the park." Then she added quickly, "You don't have to." He smiled. "I'd love to." They arrived early, bundled in coats and gloves, Maddie skipping ahead with a flashlight shaped like a giraffe. Sophie wore the cream-colored dress again, under a long gray wool coat Holden had brought her 2 weeks earlier. She never said thank you in grand ways, but she wore the coat every time they met, and that was enough. They spread out a picnic blanket under the old tree by the frozen pond, just like Holden and Megan had years ago. Only this time, he didn't feel like a ghost reliving a memory. He felt present. They ate from thermoses, simple food, lentil soup, warm bread, chocolate muffins Holden had baked himself or tried to. They were a little burnt, but Maddie didn't seem to mind. Then, as the sky darkened and the first firework popped in the distance, Holden felt Sophie's hand slide into his. Not dramatically, not seeking attention, just a quiet confirmation of what they were becoming. Maddie leaned against him, pointing at every explosion like it was the first. "I like the gold ones best," she whispered. "Me too," Holden said. But he wasn't watching the fireworks anymore. He was watching them. Later, after Maddie had fallen asleep in Sophie's lap and the sky was still blinking with color, Holden leaned closer. "Thank you," he said softly. Sophie glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "For what?" "For letting me be part of this. Your life. Her life. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again." She studied him for a long moment, her face lit by the warm flicker of distant fire. "Tell me about her," she said. He knew who she meant, and he didn't flinch. "Megan," he began, "was loud, in the best way. She laughed at everything, especially the things that weren't funny. She never wore matching socks. She made pancakes on Wednesdays and used way too much vanilla." Sophie smiled gently. "She didn't want kids at first," he continued. "Said she was scared she'd mess them up. And then Lila came and she just became someone else. Stronger, softer, braver." He paused. "She died 2 winters ago. Hit by a truck on black ice. I got the call while I was changing Lila's diaper. I don't remember what I said. I just remember the silence afterward, like the world had turned to glass." Sophie reached across Maddie's small sleeping form and took his hand. "You couldn't save her," she said, voice steady but soft. "No," Holden replied. "But I spent months trying to pretend I could have. If I'd made her take a different route, called at the right moment, asked her to stay home. It's ridiculous, I know. It's not." He looked at her. "We always look for ways to blame ourselves," Sophie said, "because blaming fate feels too big, too cold. Holden nodded, throat tight. I stopped living the day she died. I kept moving. I kept showing up for Lila. But inside, I just quit. Sophie looked down at Maddie, then back at him. You didn't quit. You grieved. He let out a shaky breath. I thought grief would go away. That one day I'd wake up and not feel it. But it just changed. She gave a quiet laugh. It doesn't go away. It makes space for new things, not to replace the old. Just to live alongside it. Holden stared at her. You make space, he said, in ways you don't even realize. They sat like that for a long while, watching the sky bloom and fade in color. Then Sophie said, almost in a whisper, I was so scared to let you in. I know. I thought if I let someone in, I'd have to owe them something. You don't. She smiled faintly. But I want to. Holden leaned in, then kissed her forehead first, then her lips slowly, gently, with no urgency. Just the kind of kiss that says, I see you. I respect you. I'm not going anywhere. Maddie stirred in her sleep and muttered, too much kissing. They both laughed, muffled and warm in the cold air. On the walk home, Sophie wrapped her arm through his, not for warmth, but for belonging. At the door to their apartment, she stopped. Stay. Holden looked at her. Are you sure? She nodded. I don't want this to be temporary, she said. He stepped inside, closing the door behind them. And for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel like he was closing a door to the past. He was opening one to something new, something earned, something that felt exactly like coming home. 3 months later, the snow had melted. Not just on the sidewalks and rooftops, but in Holden's chest, in Sophie's eyes, and in the space between what was and what might be. Spring had crept into the city gently, one tulip at a time. Central Park was dotted with joggers, kids with sticky ice cream hands, and lovers sitting shoulder to shoulder on benches that had once belonged to ghosts. Holden sat on one of those benches now. He held a bouquet of yellow daffodils in one hand, and a tattered drawing in the other, Maddie's crayon masterpiece, a big house with too many windows, a dog they didn't own yet, and 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun that wore sunglasses. He smiled. A familiar voice rang out behind him. There he is, my official ride to kindergarten orientation. Sophie stood there, laughing, holding Maddie's hand. The little girl wore a dress with unicorns and jelly beans all over it, and a determined expression that looked a little too much like her mother's. Did you get the snacks? Maddie asked. Carrot sticks and chocolate chip cookies, Holden replied. Balance, she nodded. Very responsible. Sophie arched an eyebrow. She's been watching food documentaries again. Holden chuckled and stood handing Sophie the flowers. What's the occasion? She asked, smelling them. You start your nursing residency next week, he said, and Maddie's about to take over the school system. Sophie looked at him, eyes misting just slightly. We wouldn't be here without you. No, Holden replied. You were always going to get here. I just got lucky enough to walk beside you. They sat on the bench for a moment before the orientation. A breeze danced through the cherry blossom branches above. Children laughed in the distance. Somewhere, a street performer played soft jazz on a saxophone. It was all so normal. And yet to Holden, it felt miraculous. He looked at Sophie. Really looked. Her face had changed. Still the same eyes, same freckles, same stubborn tilt of the chin. But now there was something steadier behind it all. A woman who had stopped apologizing for surviving. A woman who no longer braced for life to fall apart. And he loved her. Not for who she might become, but for who she had fought to be. Hey, she said, suddenly nudging him. You okay? He nodded, then reached into his coat pocket. I was going to wait, he murmured. But this feels like the right moment. Sophie blinked. Wait for what Holden pulled out a small wooden box. It wasn't velvet or satin-lined, just smooth cedar sanded down and polished with care. Inside was a delicate silver ring, simple understated with a small blue stone in the center. "It was my wife's," he said. "I asked her sister's permission. She said Megan would have liked you." Sophie's breath caught. "I'm not asking you to marry me," Holden added quickly. "Not yet. Not if it's too soon. I'm just asking if I can build something real with you. No pressure, no finish line. Just us, choosing each other. Every day." Sophie stared at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at him, and the tears that formed weren't of fear or panic or overwhelm. They were of readiness. "You already are building it," she whispered. "And I want to keep building it with you." She closed the box and held it tight in both hands like it was more than jewelry, like it was a promise. At the school, Holden stayed outside while Sophie took Maddie in. He watched through the glass as his girls, yes, his girls navigated sign-in sheets and name tags and a sea of other parents and kids. And he didn't feel like an outsider anymore. He felt home. That evening, they walked back through the park as the sun dipped low, casting amber light across the path. Maddie skipped ahead, swinging her little backpack like it held treasure. "I'm going to be a doctor and a singer and a pizza chef," she announced. Sophie laughed. "Don't forget astronaut." "Oh yeah, that too." Holden squeezed Sophie's hand. She looked up at him. "What are you thinking?" He paused. "That everything broken in me," he said, "quietly led me to this." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Not broken, just bent toward where you needed to go." He kissed her hair, and together they walked forward. 3 shadows stretched long in the golden light, 3 lives stitched together, not by fate or perfection, but by the quiet decision to stay, to show up, and to believe again. Not in fairy tales, but in each other. And beneath the last melting snow by the sidewalk, something had taken root. Something that didn't need magic to grow. Just love. If this story touched your heart, the way it touched ours, we'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and share a little piece of your corner of the world with us. And if you find comfort, hope, or just a moment of peace in stories like this, consider subscribing to Soul Moments Story. We're here to remind you that even in quiet places, love still speaks, and kindness always matters. Thank you truly for spending this time with us. Your presence means more than you know. Until next time, stay kind, and never stop believing in second chances.